And I'd like to welcome everybody. I think this is the 14th Futures of Design Education meetup. It's getting quite scary. It's almost quite serious. And we have quite a lot of people signed up today, which is also a little bit scary and nerve-wracking for us. Just a couple of tiny bits of housekeeping. Next month's Futures discussion will hopefully be on the 15th of April. I'm just waiting to confirm the time with Ishan Khosla. Ishan's work is really, really interesting. He works out of, I think it's Delhi, he's mainly based in, but he works in North India in local contexts, developing sort of mini design program. Particularly he works in typography and font production, but with a kind of co-community and a co-production sort of slant to it. Really, really interesting work. Some of it is really interesting. I'll try to share his website in the chat after this or while we're doing the presentation. So hopefully that's on the 15th of April. Hopefully it'll be round about the same time. As I say, I'm just waiting to confirm the time, but that should be a really interesting one, another interesting context. But back to today's one. And today, usually I would hand over to somebody else, but today, this is actually part of, I suppose, something that we have been working on as a team. I'll just introduce the team in a second. Thank you very much, James, that's brilliant. In fact, we'll just kick off and introduce ourselves straight away. James, do you want to move on to the next one? And we'll just go from left to right. Colin, do you want to kick off?
Sure. Hi, my name is Colin Gray. I'm an associate professor at Purdue University, and I lead a program in user experience design. And my work on studio pedagogy is really focused on studio and emerging disciplines such as user experience design and human-computer interaction design.
Cool. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Derek Jones. I'm a senior lecturer in design at the Open University in the UK. And we're an entirely distance education institution. So the studio that I teach in is a distributed online virtual studio, if you want to think of it that way. But I've also worked in studios. I'm an architect to trade. So yeah, I've worked and taught in quite a number of different studios. Colin, I think that Elizabeth can't join us today.
Yeah, Elizabeth unfortunately can't join us. Elizabeth is a professor of instructional systems technology at Indiana University, and she's been a pioneer in studio education in the instructional design discipline.
And James B.
Hi, I'm James, and I'm an associate professor of architecture at Umeå University in the north of Sweden. And I came to meet these fine colleagues through a number of the digital meetups that happened at the start of the pandemic, which led to this project here.
And Nicole, I think I saw Nicole coming in. Yeah, there we go. Woo.
Hi, I am here. Yes, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Lotz. I'm working closely with Derek at the Open University. We've been doing loads of work on distance studios, but I'm also very interested in hybrid studios. So blending those things, and I've been kind of grew up in traditional studios, so it's really quite interesting. I'm very interested in the whole breadth of studios, but particularly in the social component and those things you don't usually take for you take for granted, and you don't have them online easily. So that's my core interest here.
Cool, thanks, Nicole. And Lorraine Marshall, unfortunately she can't join us today. She's in Australia. She actually teaches at the University of South Australia, I think. And she's in the education sort of side of things over there as well. So she couldn't join us this morning because I think it's something like 4 o'clock in the morning or something over there. There was some excuse. I can't remember what it was exactly. But Lorraine's been with the project from the start as well, and she's very interested in, I think, particularly the affective components and the physical, the materiality of studio, and the importance of it as an aesthetic thing. James.
Thank you, Derek. Hello, I'm James Corazzo. I work at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK, and I am also obviously interested in studios, and particularly interested in the materiality of learning. And I write with collaborators, one of which is here today, Layla, about things like sofas in studios and what they are doing and how they may be participating more than we think in what happens in studio.
Brilliant. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, James? So just a quick couple of words on why we started this project and why we've been looking at it. And the sofa example that James gave, I'll maybe come back to that. There's a reason why sofas and weird things like that matter in studio. But before you even get to that weirdness, There's another thing that's really quite important as well, that studio has been around for quite a long time. If you want to think about it, you could argue that studio as a mode of learning and teaching, if it is just that spatial arrangement of expert and novice, or people experimenting and trying to do something or make something, it's been around for a good tens of thousands of years potentially. So there's something really quite important about studio. And if you look at many of the authors, many of the people who write about design education or studio education, I think we did a quick straw poll and all of us have written that sentence, studio is central to design education. It's just one of those things that's almost assumed in some ways, but it is also quite important. There's this deep importance about the lingering nature. And certain writers have written about it in particular ways, that it's very pervasive in curriculum, it's pervasive in the literature, and it's also pervasive as a culture, as a stickiness, as Oren Shreve would call it. Could we move to the next slide, James? Thanks. And this is where it gets to the kind of sofa bit. There's also something quite frustrating about studio, particularly when you speak to, for example, other educators or people who have not been through the experience of studio. And this is kind of like when you speak to non-specialist designers or people who haven't been through the experience of a design education. It is something that is experiential. So it is something that you can't necessarily define or list out or set out. There's something frustrating about studio in terms of its lack of definition. I know certainly from my personal point of view, when I was doing my PhD, I had hoped, because as I said earlier, we work in online and distance studio spaces. I thought I'd be able to, just go to the library, find the big book of studio education, look through it and ask a question of, what do you see in physical studios or proximate studios that you don't see in online studios, or how can you compare and contrast these modes of studio? But there wasn't anything, there's nothing. There isn't this kind of single reference text. And unpicking why that's the case and why there's this need for a richness, a kind of definition without definition. Again, I can only recommend strongly Oren Shreve's book on this, these kind of tensions between persistence but impermanence, these kind of like tensions of apparent contradictions. It's really interesting. So there's something really important about studio, but there's also something kind of frustrating about it in terms of it being a thing, I suppose. So that's kind of led us to what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve with this as a project. I think I'll hand over to James on this one.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. So what is this going to be? What is studio properties? We have fallen upon the happy definition of writing a field guide to studio. And my sort of, when I think of a field guide, it maybe reflects my own personal interest. Maybe you have one on your bookshelf. It's something that you could take into an environment which you may not be completely familiar with. You might be a novice, you might be an expert, you might be looking to expand your knowledge in new areas, but it's something you take with you and that you refer to, and that provides you with a set of identifying features, vocabulary to help you understand that environment. Who is it for? Well, the great thing about the field guide is it is not necessarily going to be just for experts, and it's not going to be, as I said, for novices. It's hopefully going to be for an audience that spans the studio curious to the studio terrified. Perhaps it is your first assignment teaching in studio. We spoke about that before the seminar began with one of our guests today. It could be a companion piece that introduces you to this strange learning environment, or it could be something that allows you to critically reflect on things that you have been doing in studio for a long time and maybe want to understand a bit better, and also to understand the subtle differences in the genus of different subspecies and species. As Derek has hinted in the preceding slides, there is no shared reference point. There's no single text that does this across disciplines. There is lots of very good research about the studio and about what goes on in studio and about how things happen in studio. But we want to try and make a point of reference that would be as relevant to a beginning educator in architecture, to a seasoned and experienced educator in graphic design or any other art and design discipline. And today's presentation is called Studio Properties, and we've been working with that. We occasionally talk about whether that might not be the title of the book. We're sort of, there are other contenders, but we've most often and for the longest time spoken about properties. These are things that you might encounter in studio, and they are things that people might have said about studio. So we have been working for a long time now, maybe a year and a half, I think, coming up to a year and a half, using collaborative tools, using Google Docs, using Miro, using cloud-based software to work collaboratively and almost reliably every week for the last year and a half, with some exceptions and some holidays. We have worked to write these properties, and we've written in varying lengths quite a few of them. And on the right-hand side, you can see a sort of template of one that we were talking about earlier, where we've tried to define it with the short definition, reference key texts that talk about it. Maybe there's a headline quote that really sums it up for us. Write an overview or a description, and then talk about some of the critical points, the more detailed aspects of it, and then all the references at the end. And so if you can imagine that there might be 50, 100, 200 of these properties, these are going to be collated into a volume, into a book. Derek, I can't remember. I think you take this first example, and then I will come back in a moment.
Yep, cool. That's no problem at all. So the easiest way to maybe explain them is to just give you a really kind of quick example. So here's one of them. This is one of the kind of more apparently obvious ones, and hopefully there's some features about this that might make you realize that there's a kind of importance to sometimes saying the obvious. So this one is called No Front, and it simply observes that unlike a classroom, a studio space, or the spatiality, the arrangement of a studio, it doesn't necessarily have a single focal point or a front from which a teacher teaches or transmits knowledge as a form of education. And this isn't just a spatial arrangement, it's also a kind of cultural arrangement or an educational arrangement, a pedagogical arrangement. It's also arguably a power arrangement. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. But very famously, there's a couple of writers who do explicitly observe the fact that you go from a classroom into a studio and you notice this difference in spatial organization of people doing different things, of moving about. And if we could go to the next slide, James. It's absolutely fine to say that these things are different, but what's interesting and what we want to try to get across with the properties is to say, what's the purpose behind that, or so what? And it doesn't mean that there's no structure in studio. In fact, quite the opposite. It means that there's a whole bunch of other really interesting structures that arise from proximities. And these can just be obvious spatial arrangements, like two students meeting over a desk, or a mini sort of update crit session between a student and tutor, or a small group crit session, or informal clusters, or social settings, people who you like to sit beside, you don't like to sit beside. James mentioned the sofa right at the start. All of these proximities actually, I'm not going to say dictate what the studio does, but the studio is a space within which these different types of relation can actually emerge. So again, you're saying something really obvious with the properties, but hopefully what we'll do when you read one of these properties, we will actually try to identify what the interesting bits are and the authors to whom you might go to find out a little bit more about them. We're still up in the air about whether we might actually put in some suggestions or things that you might do in terms of practice in this. We're not too sure about that yet, but that's the idea behind a studio, behind a property. My apologies. That is, I'm not going to say saying something obvious, but it's saying something interesting about what happens in studio. And here's another example for James. You want to pick up on?
Yeah, sorry, did not mean to
hurry
you along there.
I'm a talker, that's okay.
So no front is a kind of conceptual property. It's a really good example of something that is both spatial, but as Derek was saying, also pedagogical, and it's a difference, it's a characteristic of studio. One that I think is a good example is the crit. It is a property, it is something inherent in design studio, and which we all know is central to the methodology and pedagogy of how we work in design education. And it's obviously something that has been written about a great deal in lots of different ways. So this is a good example of a really deep and complex property, which has relationships to lots of other properties in the studio, in the sort of first tier, second tier, third tier, perhaps. So we can understand those strengths, those relationships, because it's about how the relationship between teacher and student is defined in many ways in the studio. It comes in many different forms. We know this, that there are formal critiques, there are group critiques, there are desk critiques where you sit side by side, there are peer critiques where students take on the role of friendly teacher for the day. And therefore, understanding those differences is inherent to understanding the nature of the crit and of critique itself. Critique has many purposes. I'm aware I'm using the word critique and the crit interchangeably in this way. And I think that speaks a little bit to the complexity of this, but I'll persist for a moment if you don't mind. Critique has many purposes: to defend, articulate, redefine ideas in ways that are supported by the formal pedagogy, with assessment serving as its core purpose. So we tend to value some of these purposes over others, and that is also important when we think about what the crit is as a property in the studio and a property of studio pedagogy. Engagement in critique not only takes on different modes of performance with differing sets of participants, but it also takes on different purposes with underlying ways of being and acting that makes these purposes coherent. Most prominently and visibly, critique is organized around process and the development of designerly capacity, taking on the purpose of evaluation and assessment. So we know this, and you've probably read about the studio and about how crit sort of reinforces behavior. And I think this is also fundamental to understanding many of the properties. We refer to some of the literature that talks about the way in which knowledge and praxis are reified through the crit and through critique, and how that affects the development of the student and the relationship between the teacher and the students and other students. And fundamentally, and most importantly, we know, because it's been written about for so long and in such great quality and in such volume, that the crit and the process of critique can produce and reproduce harm. Central to this harm is the asymmetrical power relations through which most of critique is accomplished, and the deficit model, which is assumed in many models of critique. And there have been many evaluations of the harm perpetrated through critique practices. And as you can see, we reference many of these here. So if you think about this book becoming a field guide, this is hopefully a field guide that helps you become aware of the great body of research that is out there and that has been done and that precedes us, and may not be limited to your discipline, maybe in another discipline that shares a studio, but which is described or addressed differently.
Over to me, the other James. Thank you, James. As Derek and James have already said, they've spoken about different kinds of properties, and we're going to talk about a few more in a minute, but we thought it might be useful just to say a little bit about how we're trying to work out how these properties relate to each other, which has been both fun and philosophically very challenging. I think, Derek's alluded to this at the beginning. Lawrence Singleton talk about the idea of messy objects, and we think the studio is a good example of a messy object. Messy object is something that defies knowing. They define mess itself as other to clarity, other to systematic study and knowledge. It defies knowing. And I think we could probably say that literally studios can be messy. Conceptually, they can be messy. And I'm even going to say it, epistemologically and ontologically, they can be messy. It can be messy getting to know what is going on in a studio, and messy because different kinds of worlds arguably are being constantly built in those spaces. So studios is messy object. And then was it 2 years ago, Derek, could you go to the next slide actually, please, James? Derek was talking about this idea of properties. It turns out Derek, he was kind of the originator of the idea of properties in studio. He'd been keeping this list and of properties he'd noticed in the literature or when people were speaking about studio. And I can remember when Derek showed me this or told me about this list, I thought, oh, at last, we're going to be able to that messy object, we're suddenly going to be able to define it by having these kind of discrete things within studio. And that will build a space that maybe we will be able to know studio. It felt really attractive. Of course, I was terribly wrong about that. Could you go to the next slide, please, James? There was this kind of idea, at least in my head, that if we could just document enough of the properties, then the contours of studio would really it would show us the shape, if you like, of studio. So what quickly happened is that if you go to the next slide, we start writing and talking about what properties might be in a studio. And we go from Derek's original list of about 30, I don't know, we went to about 170 within about 2 meetings. And so in no time, studio starts to multiply and get complicated, fluid, and resist any attempts to hold it still for a moment, I suppose. If you could go to the next slide, please, James. So I guess it really felt like having all those properties felt like trying to balance loads of objects, loads of different small objects in your arms, and things keep falling down every time you try to pick something else up. And we started to think, I guess, about a way to kind of wrap that or to hold these properties together. And thinking about bags is kind of possibly useful here. And what I really like about bags is they both shape things that you put in there, and they are shaped by the very things that you put in there as well. And I suppose by thinking about bags, we really started to think about, we needed to get into the idea of the relations between the properties that we're writing about, because pointing at things like no front and crit, yeah, there's some utility in that, but understanding that these different things in studios in different ways relate feels really important to get into. So if we could just go to the next slide. Thanks, James. One of the ways, as many of you will know in a forum like this, in which we can make sense potentially of domains, is to map them. As Corner says, like, mapping can both kind of expose, reveal things, and it can structure things. Liz Sanders talks about the idea of using mapping as a way to hold a domain still long enough that you can kind of understand the relationships between things. So that kind of felt maybe instructive. If we go to the next slide, please. And we played around with looking at relations between the properties in all sorts of ways. But again, being in a room full of people who, really perhaps have a good understanding that mapping also comes with all sorts of problematics. Maps can flatten, they can fix, they can distort, and they can freeze things. And I think one thing we can all agree on is that our studios are not all one thing. They're not all going to look the same in any way. So it felt like it needed to be more fluid than that. If we could just go to the next slide, please. What we found really useful, Sarah Pink, the ethnographer, talks about this idea of mapping out and mapping through, when she's kind of an ethnographer, I guess, of spaces and places. And mapping out might be the thing that I've just been describing, taking this kind of bird's eye view of studio and pointing at these different properties and organizing them in a way that we think might be instructive for people to look at. But again, that tends to fix, it tends to take this kind of view from above on things, which comes with its own baggage in all sorts of ways. And if we just go to the next slide, James. Pink talks about this idea of moving through, as she says there, moving through enables us to understand life as it progresses through environments. And there's something about that situated description that felt kind of really useful. And there's something here, I guess, what Pink's also doing is bringing like time and space and people back into the equation there. So if we could just go to the next slide. So I think where we've got to in terms of relations is we're beginning to think about studio, and I find this personally very kind of constructive, as this as what Rosaldo calls a busy intersection, a place where a number of distinct social processes intersect. What's really interesting about that concept of intersection is it kind of captures this sense of movement, it captures time, it captures the sense that things come with history, and it captures the, I guess, the serendipity these different configurations that can be constantly be forming in studios in different kinds of ways. So while we're not sure how a book becomes an intersection, that's a kind of interesting, I guess, conceptual jumping off point for us to think about how these different properties interact. And I'm going to hand over to Colin in a moment. It's going to say a little bit about how we're bringing those properties to life and showing different forms of intersection. So yeah, over to you, Colin.
Thanks, James. So as has been alluded to already, there's this uneasy relationship between the dynamic nature of the properties, how they sort of appear in practice. And so one of the things that we've worked on as a group is to identify not only how to examine individual studio properties, but also how can we interrogate them, prioritize them, operate on them with some precision, recognizing that they're interdependent, not dependent. And so how can they be understood in relation to each other? And how can we bring that to life through specific enacted instances of studio? So these instances, which we've represented as a number of different narratives drawn from our experiences in practice, allow properties to be explored in the context of the complex and often messy ways in which they interact. Next slide. So in one example that I'll share with you, a studio instructor named Morgan has taught in studio for a reasonable number of years. They've gotten pretty comfortable, and they've largely reproduced the cultural norms of the studio that they themselves had experienced. So I'm going to share just a snippet of a larger narrative that we've written to introduce Morgan's case. Morgan takes a deep breath and starts to replay the last half hour in their mind. Brianna, one of her students who was presenting last in the lineup today, had clearly been unsure of herself, and several other students had smelled blood in the water, going after the weaknesses in her draft design with the cutting precision they always employed. Brianna totally melted down. She shouted at the other students, then ripped her own work down off the big corkboard and stormed out of the room. One of the students spoke in a sneering tone. Well, I guess someone's got a thin skin, getting a nasty laugh from several in the group. Oh, shut the fuck up, Morgan snapped before stalking out of the room themselves, simultaneously shocked, shaken, and appalled at the students and at their own reaction to what had just happened. Reflecting now, Morgan recalls stopping by the studio late in the evening about a week ago and startling Brianna, who had been curled up on one of the ratty secondhand sofas in the studio, sobbing out loud. Morgan had dropped onto the couch beside her to ask what was wrong. Nothing's wrong that anybody can fix, Brianna heaved a sigh, then blurted out, it's just getting real hard to be the only one like me in this class. Brianna was saying something here that rang a bell, the only one like me. Ouch. They knew how that felt. Their cisgender colleagues, even those careful with pronouns, always seemed to assume that everyone shared the same values about everything. As Morgan thought, that's got to be lonely. Brianna sniffled, I want to be a designer, I really do. But everyone gets it and I don't. I don't think I'm going to make it here. Replaying this encounter in their mind now, Morgan feels the way that they do when the optometrist chooses a better lens and a fuzzy part of the eye chart pops into focus. We always lose the Briannas, they realize, and maybe not just because they don't measure up. Maybe critique and all the rest of studio does lock them out. They don't just choose to stand aloof or fail to fit in. I don't think they're getting the same chance as everyone else. I'm gonna pass it over to Derek.
Cool. Thanks, Colin. I don't know about anyone else, but the narrative, anytime I rehear it, I mean, I've heard this several times now, Colin, but it brings back memories of my experience in studio. I'm sure we've all had similar experiences. I think these deep moments that actually change us and affect us, I think it is important that we understand the emotional transformation that happens in studio, the affective transformation, the aesthetic transformation. And all too often we focus on some of the operational stuff. So I suppose this property, as an example, this is something that I'm exceptionally obsessed by, as any of you who know me will be bored of hearing about, is this notion of what we don't see, what we don't pay attention to, the stuff that we're ignorant of, the stuff that we know we don't know, and the stuff that we don't know we don't know. And that deliberate suppression or that deliberate ignorance is a thing. And sometimes that's just to make ourselves feel comfortable because we don't want to confront certain things. For me, I'm okay with the fact that studio isn't a perfect thing. And I think I know a lot of educators and studio practitioners who are really interested in understanding why it isn't a perfect thing, and not how to make it perfect, but how to make it better than it was yesterday, or slightly different, or to keep it up to date, or to keep it alive. And that's why I think things like invisibilities do matter a hell of a lot. And particularly when you're working in a traditional educational institution where pressure on space, pressure on resources, it doesn't necessarily recognize these informalities. If at least in this volume, we can bring together some of these semi-formalities or informalities and get them to be taken seriously as artifacts, as things, or as events, or as experiences that are a necessary part of studio, not a nice to have, but a fundamental underpinning of what the experience of transformation is in studio, then I think that's quite important. So this is James's couch example. I think it's quite important that we do actually understand the types of invisibility, because at least then it's kind of like the fish in water thing. You don't know what you don't know until somebody points it out. And if we can at least, I suppose, bring to the attention of studio educators a few of these kind of things, then I think that's a good thing. Personally speaking, we'll maybe have a bit more of a look at some of the invisibilities a bit later when we come to the end of the presentation. But I think I will hand over. Is it Colin next? Are you? Yep.
Yeah, back to me. So thanks, Derek. So Habits and Rituals is our next studio property that we're going to explore. And I think we just have one more after this. So this property spans both material and pedagogical practices and the many invisibilities that were indicated in the property that Derek just shared. So these habits and rituals both structure the instructors and students' experience of studio, but it can also inform how the students are able to, or can be actively excluded from, becoming enculturated in studio. Can we go to the next slide, James? So you can imagine there are many different forms of habits and rituals that are to one degree or another visible in the studio. This could include things like the forms of materiality or representation that are normalized, the interactional patterns among the students and instructors, the types of project work that are undertaken and in what combinations of students, individually or in groups. Visible rituals can also include dominant pedagogical norms in the studio, such as organizations of critique events, including responsibilities, goals, and tools. Next slide. As important as the visible habits and rituals of studios are, though, the invisible elements can have just as big of an impact on the learner's experience of studio. And these can be positive in the sense that students enculturate into the discipline, are able to form a supportive community with shared norms, or that they're able to travel on the same journey of aesthetic learning experience as a narrative. But they can produce also predictable structure, like starting each studio session with music. However, habits and rituals can just as easily exclude, injure, or stereotype, as mentioned in the narrative of Brianna's experience. From Anthony's characterization of the design jury as a firing line, to the normalization of overwork, to the exclusion of atypical personalities or identities whose diversity could be normalized. As with all of these properties, habits and rituals serve as a useful lens to understand, describe, and critique many other facets of studio and the student experience at large.
Okay, and if we move to the next slide, James, thank you very much. This is just a final quick example of a kind of semi-formal or an informal or an invisible property of studio. It's serendipity. It's one of the big reasons why people collect in the same space. It's in order to see other things and for that kind of random encounter or allegedly random encounter to then lead to new thinking, to new ideas, to synthesis of ideas, to conversations. It's that water cooler moment, or as we say in the UK, over coffee or over tea. Again, it's a simple, obvious thing to say. And I just want to make two quick points about this. First of all, that notion of a spatial encounter, the examples that I'm giving you here, this is one of our early activities of making a banana in one of our distance education courses. And this is a studio where you might be, 500 to 900 other students. Serendipity works just as much in an online and a distributed studio as it does in a physical and proximate space, okay? I think the point about what we all tried to do over the last 2 years of translating physical studio to online spaces, we weren't translating the invisibilities, all of this kind of stuff, the serendipitous encounter, all the little semi-formalities. That's the actual good stuff. That's the stuff that actually makes up studio. And when you don't allow for that, and we put a lot of effort at the Open University into trying to allow for these things, and we don't even get anywhere near some of the stuff we'd like to do. If you don't do that, then you're missing actually quite a lot of the stuff that makes up studio. That'll be the first point. The second one, James, if you could move on to the next slide. Again, you might see serendipity as this kind of random thing. It's just something you assume that happens in studio, but there is actually literature. There is actually research behind it. It is actually composed by some theories. This comes from Woods in Florida. Mel Woods, by the way, her work in serendipity there's some lovely stuff out of Duncan of Jordanson here in Dundee. But they divide it into these two concepts, the preparation and the insight, that yes, it is that random encounter, but if you're not prepared as a designer, if you're not ready and receptive and open and observing and then doing something with that observation as a designer, that readiness of being is as important as the random encounter, then it'll just be wasted. So again, there are things that you can do in your studio practice to help develop serendipity, even if it is just the preparation of it. So that's just a really quick example of a property that probably many of us take for granted, but there is actually some A, serious research behind it, and B, we're not presenting this research in a really deep and technical way. We're presenting it hopefully in an interesting and intriguing way that might make readers want to follow up on it, or might just make educators think about what they do in studio and what their studio practice is, and a little thing that they might change to do something different tomorrow. So that's what's behind all the properties and the relational content and the narratives as well. And so, yeah, thank you very much for your time. I think, yep. So yeah, if anybody has any questions or any thoughts on, I guess, what we're presenting, then please feel free to shout out now. Cool. Yeah, there's always that weird silence in Zoom after you do a presentation. I mean, it's bad enough in a physical space, but yeah.
No, I have a question.
Of course you do.
Yeah, why not, right? So it sounds like like I'm thinking particularly about the sofas, right? So it sounds like you have designated spaces for studio, but I have had to teach probably in every space in rooms that are adapted on the fly for studios. So I'm kind of interested in the properties when your studio has to be mobile, meaning that you only have access to the room 2 minutes before you start, and you have to remove every trace of your existence when you leave. Um, I don't know if there are properties, but I wonder, because I think a lot of people teach in that kind of context where we're still trying to teach a studio, but where we have to use traditional classrooms with bad furniture and stuff like that. So I don't know if there's a question there, but that's the thing that I'm thinking about.
It makes me excited, Leslie Ann, to think about what is it that defines a studio? Because if you do your job, then it is a studio, right? Even if it doesn't look like a studio. So I think we're really interested in those tangible and intangible things that you do and that your students do and that others do that make it a studio. I've worked in a few places where the studios are perfect. I mean, architecturally, they're perfect and they're terrible to teach in. So there's an inverse question there about what it is that we do when we come together in this space, whether it is a corridor or a classroom, that makes it special. I mean, maybe you can help us write this book. I don't know.
Brilliant. Yeah, I would just completely add to what James said. Yeah, I mean, there's no sense by which, Leslie Ann, for example, that you, just to build on what James said, that you didn't create a studio in those interstitial spaces. You bring a very designerly mindset to all your work. I know that. And yes, we've got lots of properties that look at those kind of interstitial, and there's some actually as well that explicitly look at what happens when those things are interrupted. So for example, the studio as an extension of cognition. That fact that just having a space where you're cognitively connected, where your stuff is to your right or that your books are over here, that's a physical example of it, but you can have digital examples. You can also have emotional examples of that too. Where do you feel connected? It's like the questions now we're asking of our longer and larger extended studios. It's where are the spaces that you feel safe to open your mind? Where are the spaces that you feel safe to express your identity? Where are the spaces that you feel you are connected to your background, your being? And can that be a studio? Can you bring that studio into studio? So yeah, all these intangibles are definitely, well, they'll be in the final one, because we're wrestling with this, as James said, this string bag. But yeah, it's those kind of things that we are really keen to hear. Okay. So yeah, Morgan, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, super exciting work. I'm really excited for when the full book comes out. And one thing that you touched on that I'm really interested in is sort of this intergenerational passing down of like the tacit knowledge of what a studio is. And I'm wondering if you'll be touching on sort of how to like keep the good parts of those sort of passing down of what your experience of a studio is like, but then also being able to detangle all of the parts that perhaps aren't as good or are harmful.
I'm going to do a Teflon overcoat with this one, Colin, maybe.
Well, that's a wonderful question, Morgan. And I mean, this is something that I think several of us sort of share, is this desire to make visible these like practices of the studio so that they can be inspected. For some, it might be the studio curious that are wanting to take on some new pedagogical norms. But as you saw in one of the narrative pieces that we shared today, there'll be a couple narratives that really touch on this need to inspect our practices, understand them better, and then perhaps do better. In fact, we probably should be doing better in a number of these capacities. And so, yes, I think this is really critical to building this knowledge base around studio, not just to do it as an intellectual exercise, but actually to use it to build more emancipatory pedagogical practices in relation to studio.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're still wrestling with is perhaps the extent to which we do that. I mean, just now we're trying to really fix it on what's existing in terms of literature, in terms of practice. And that has a massive, massive hobbling effect. As Elizabeth keeps reminding us, you know, if you do that, then you're never considering what might be or what could be or other spaces of practice. But I think, as Colin says, even just having something that is a mark in the sand that says, here's the stuff we know just now, and absolutely no attempt to say that is all there is, absolutely no sense of that whatsoever. Say, look, oh, and by the way, here's the holes. We haven't even touched on positionality, for example, yet, which we might come on to a wee bit later. But here's all the gaps, here's the things we haven't covered. And at least having that as a starting point might be quite good. We're moving into the space now where we're thinking about, maybe we have this fixed thing that at least captures this first bit, and that a whole bunch of companion stuff might then come out of that. And that's the more living practice. I'd love to see something that was much more critical round about it, that really inspected or interrogated and collected what people are doing, not just the research, but what people are doing, because that is still one of our most important forms of knowledge as well. Yeah, I don't know if any of the rest of the team wanted to come in on that one either. It's definitely something that we keep coming back to and we need checked on, and it's good to hear that.
Derek, there is a question in the chat from Catherine, which I guess it sort of leads on from some of the stuff we've just been talking about. I don't know whether it's a really interesting question that I think it'd be worth us trying to respond to, but not answer, because that would be really hard.
And besides which, we've got the cop-out clause, which is, you know, you can't really define studio. Yeah, I've got a lot of sympathy with this one, that studio is a state of mind. The work that Nicole and I have done at the OU shows just how important it is to actually see putting together all of the bits and pieces, including the curriculum, including all that wider stuff. And I think Colin did a bit of this as well. It's that notion of a student negotiating an understanding, if you like, of the curriculum. And that's very much an emergent practice. So in that sense, yeah, it's a kind of attitudinal thing. I know certainly that what we're doing at the OU just now in terms of looking at the new qualification, we are really moving away from, you know, skills and superficial stuff, really into that space of what's the disposition you want to develop, or what's the attitude, what's the states of mind, what's the emotional or affective things that you want to see emerge in students' practice. And in saying that, for me, that's a kind of vague definition of studio, and that's that's my personal opinion. I'm not going to say that that's a shared opinion by any means. I don't know if anybody else wanted to jump in on that one.
I think the nature of that attitude is also interesting because it changes over time. It changes in your time as a student, it changes in your time as a teacher, and it changes depending on who you work with and who, even from day to day, who you're with. I am friends with a great teacher in the UK who I was a student with of architecture, who was probably one of the most self-critical, self-aware as we began our pathway to being architects. And I remember towards the end of our first year studying architecture, she actually said out loud, with a kind of burst of a great grunt of frustration, she said, "What have I become? I just said vertical circulation when I meant staircase." And she was talking there about the attitude or the change that can happen in the way that you approach your work, you talk about your work, all those sorts of things. So I like this idea that the studio is an attitude, and perhaps in discussion with, like Leslie Ann's point earlier, you go into any space and you make it a studio through certain actions, explicit and implicit. But then it is also something that changes with time and enculturation, which is obviously one of the more fascinating aspects of it as a process.
Can I just, sorry, James.
Yeah, Catherine saying in the chat, yeah, designerly attitude. Yeah, we talk about designerly attitudes a lot. And those are the skill. It's not a two-dimensional skill or a two-dimensional knowledge that you have to demonstrate. It's an attitude that you develop over time, which can be tremendously enriching.
I think, and yeah, and just trying to build on that. And thank you, Catherine. And I realize you're not saying, can it just be an attitude in isolation there? You're saying as well as. I think it's the as well as that feels really important for me. I think of studio as a coalition. That might be a coalition of things and people. It feels like there's something really important about relatedness with studio. And one reading of studio as attitude, one reading, this might not be yours, could be that that's a thing that's owned by the person, independent of everything else. And I guess that can then travel anywhere. And I guess it could be an attitude if it remains related to and in coalition. I think that feels important. in that discussion.
Can I come in with a, there are a few of us here that are school-based educators, and I'm conscious that there has also been a whole, almost a movement around studio habits of mind and studio teaching in schools, which is sometimes related to beyond a design and technology or an art and design. It's taken to a broader view. And I'm wondering whether, as a group, you've looked at any of the literature around studio teaching in school education. Don't answer that. It was just a thought, because I wanted to pick up on a few things that the idea of the invisible and the visible, and I guess partly because of the way that pedagogies in school work, there's probably a lot of emphasis on making the invisible visible, and thinking about the crit and, you know, and that kind of like the positives and negatives of the crit. As an example, there's a group of us, and I can see Nikki Blom is here as well, that are working with a project at Delft that is called Make Design Learning Visible, and it's doing that with young children and teenagers. And it's very much one of the pedagogic strategies are about being very explicit and helping learners make things visible and helping them. So, for example, in terms of a crit, quite explicitly engaging them in activities where it's clear that this is about making them as an activator of their own learning or of another's learning. So they're kind of developing peer skills. And I'm curious, really, I mean, I also work in higher education in design department, but I'm kind of curious the extent to which you're looking at the pedagogies of making things visible, rather than just it somehow coming in through the skin. Yeah, so, well, I'll leave that there, but be interesting to hear reactions, and maybe from the other. I think also Ingveld's here as well, so she may have some views about that.
Yeah, well, I'll maybe kick off. There's a couple of bits to that, Kate. I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that I don't think we've touched on nearly enough of the, particularly the sort of secondary or K-12 sort of education space. It's almost like higher education studio is this really quite selfish beast in some senses. Like James's, well, in your journal, that piece on the size of studio, you know, it's almost like this solipsistic thing, because you've got all the time, you've got all the space, you've got all the resources to just indulge in this, and no other subject, no other sort of spaces. Yeah, you might go to lectures or stuff like that, but the rest of your time is still in studio, and that kind of core pedagogy just dominates absolutely everything else, and we just don't question it. How it might become this more agile practice or practice in these other spaces, yeah, well, personally speaking, I don't think we've looked into that enough yet. But to touch on the visibility stuff, yes, that definitely will be in there. The trick is understanding how it is that studio is the thing that allows these things to be made visible. And again, in those big studios, those studios where you're in there all the time, that visibility, if you're lucky enough to have a persistent studio, is also persistent. It tends to be easier to make things visible. We've got some examples of how we do it, for example, at a distance and in interstitial studios, and how those artifacts, if you like, of learning become visible. But yeah, I think this is definitely something we need to do a bit more on. I don't know if anybody else wanted to come in there. And it's a shame that Elizabeth isn't here today as well, because I think there's an intersection with this and perhaps other educational domains, and how studio, if you like, the peripheries of use of studio maybe intersects with those. And maybe maybe the examples we've given as well, Kay, today, there's definitely an element of wanting to convey the kind of easy ones, if you like, the ones that everybody's going to get. So maybe some of the harder ones, or the less tangible ones that maybe respond a bit more to this. Yeah, maybe we need to slip some of those in for the next time. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wanted to come in from the team on that one. Cool.
Nikki, who is part of
Please.
my other group, is keen to ask.
Hi, everybody. Kay, yes, I found your comment really interesting. You know, in this transition, I don't know why my camera isn't. Oh, wait. there we go. Why this whole intersection between higher education design environments and school-based design environments. With the first print property that you've mentioned, Derek, you've mentioned no front to a studio environment, and in higher education that's kind of expected, but a lot of school-based environments are busy transitioning from this no front property to, this interactive type of space. And just two things that I thought, while listening to your very interesting presentation, is this idea of, if we focus on pedagogy, the one aspect of pedagogy focuses on moving designs forward, and focusing on how do we design, how do we move students' designs forward and, support them in their creative processes, but also learning through the medium of design. How do we teach our students to learn through the medium of design? That's, one of the focuses in more school-based design is not just, working with their ideas and their thoughts, but also teaching them, what are the advantages or what are the affordances of this whole process for their own learning experiences. And, the other thing that I've also found really interesting was the narrative that Colin read of the student. Just in terms of a field guide, I was wondering to what extent you are incorporating student voices in this field guide about studio pedagogy, because as academics, we often have our own views and theories about what happens in the design studio environment. But what about what students are saying about the studio? For instance, a lot of our students might see the design studio as therapy. So, what happens for them in those studios, in studio environments? What are those properties that support their own processes in the, making?
Again, I wonder, does someone else from the team want to pick up on this, so that I'm not just talking? Oh,
I can pick up on the back half of the comments. Some great thoughts. Yeah. So we are seeking to, I think, incorporate a range of different voices and perspectives on studio through the properties. Some are going to be primarily taken up from the perspective of the teacher, the educator, but many of these are felt just as much as they are, sort of expressed in physical or material form. And certainly there are members of our team that have focused on a student experience of studio. That was the focus of my dissertation work in particular. And I think bringing in these critical notions of studio from the literature also really help us to address some of not only what is designed in studio, but what is felt in studio from a student perspective. So I think that will come out in the narratives. I think two of the narratives that we have planned are from a student perspective. And many of the properties I think could be read from multiple perspectives as well.
Yeah, and sitting here just really wondering whether or not a perspective, perhaps it'd be worth actually playing with a perspective from, say, a deliberately different sort of institutional point of view. Like, for example, in K-12, that might be really interesting to try and to see what are the elements then, because once we do the narrative, I mean, what you're not seeing with the narrative is the 5 or 6 different overlays that sit over the top of that map to the properties or that map to an unpicking. There's a lovely piece that Colin and Elizabeth have done on top of, I think it's Albert, it's maybe one of the other ones, I can't remember, Colin. It's almost like a sporting narration describing what's happening, what's going on here, what are the actors doing and thinking. So it'd be really interesting actually to try that in different educational spaces. Because again, it's very easy for us to get sucked into almost like a single view of studio. And even though we are coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, different types and forms of studio, as James says, that's the bag that we've then got. That's the shape of the bag that we are going to end up with. I suppose that would be my only other point, is that when we present that bag, it will have holes in it, and we are happy and we think it should have those holes in it. So again, if it's a starting point, and if we know from discussions like these that there's a gap or there's a hole, or maybe that there's something that needs to happen in a space round about the book, in that maybe practitioner space, for example, or how it intersects or how it might be future work, I think that would be a really nice outcome as well from the project. I know that we haven't touched on the topic of positionality, but it definitely does come from a particular position. So yeah, I don't know if that fully responds, but there's definitely 2 or 3 things that we need to have a think about in there as well. Nikki, that was really interesting though. I don't know if you wanted to follow up on that one at all, by the way.
No, I just think, you know, it's like you said in the presentation as well, it's something that's hard to pin you know, to the ground. And it's, you know, I like the way that you said, you know, maps have their limitations. You know, so it's definitely a starting point. And, you know, we are constantly trying to find relationships between what's happening in higher education with regards to design and how can we improve the spaces, because we can see the potential, you know, what's possible in a design studio environment, and trying to get educators, you know, and this is one way this field guide might really be helpful for educators on school-based, you know, those who are terrified of the design studio, those who might not see the value or want to understand. They will have the concepts now to pin it down or to try and experiment and slowly get into the, you know, space where we want them or where they want to be going towards.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the more I speak to colleagues in these spaces, the more I, you know, that almost rift between secondary education and higher education, it's problematic and it's not sustainable. I don't think, and anyway, but that's another story.
Yeah,
it'd be good to talk about that. Actually, it really would. I think there was a question from Catherine, just unless anybody else has got any other questions in the audience, but Catherine, there was sector moves in terms of space shrinkage, studio politics at the macroeconomic. We've definitely got a couple of properties in there round about those sorts of things. We've got one round about the size of studio from James. There's one about the studio as an economic unit. And of course, some of the other ones that we talked about, the idea of studio as an extension of cognition, and how when you break that continuity of space, there's an issue, and you don't provide something else that gives you some kind of continuity. I don't know if anybody else wanted to throw in some other examples of that, how the studio relates to its wider context. I don't know if...
Yeah, very quickly before we hit the hour, I was thinking of Catherine's question about the space shrinkage, because as Derek mentioned, I've written about studio getting smaller. I work in a school where the management are not of my discipline. The management come from a non-design discipline. It's been really informative for a couple of years to have to explain what we do, those things that are implicit. Because very often, if you work in a design discipline, you will have experienced interactions with maybe institutional management where you're told to spend less money or use less space. And I think we, especially architects, but maybe other design disciplines, we're not very good at explaining why we deserve this a very expensive mode of pedagogy, incredibly expensive, more expensive than medicine, more expensive than chemistry with all their labs. Just the sheer number of square meters and cubic meters that we occupy. We are not very good at explaining why that is valuable. And we're not very good at engaging in discussions, because we tend to end up on the defensive saying, we've always done it this way, this is what you need, that sort of thing. I won't go further than that, but to say that's something that is on our minds when we think about that.
Well, and just maybe to build on James's point, just really quickly, it's not just necessarily a spatial question, that in a virtual or a distributed studio, such as the Open University, you know, we don't have a campus, so we don't have physical studios, but we still need services and systems that support the types of properties that we're describing in the book. And we put in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds of development into both our courses and curriculum and to some of the infrastructures that we have. And we will also have those warm, heated or interesting debates with colleagues as to why is it that you need this type of interaction? Why can't you just have a forum, or why can't you just do ... So we also need these as well, because even at a distance, you know, although we've been doing it for many years, what the pandemic showed me personally was just how implicit and tacit some of our practice was as well. As James says, it was difficult to actually describe what it is that we do. So that's one of what we hope will be one of the values of just even bringing this stuff together, that it is something you can pull down and say, yeah, but you got to take this seriously. It is a thing. Look, these people have said so. That sounds really lame now that I've said it out loud. Not just these people, several people have said so. And that even just as a collation, as a collection of things, I think that maybe is what hopefully we propose might be really quite a useful thing as a starting point. I don't know, was there anything else? I'm conscious of the fact that we're 2 minutes past the hour. We usually do tend to end these sessions quite sharp. Sorry, yeah, James.
Just to draw your attention, Derek, to the slide, we don't have it on the screen, but there was a final slide to remind us to talk about what is happening next with the book. Because just to say that we have spent the last week or two working on the book proposal, and it's off to a publisher imminently. And that's very exciting because it's committing us to the next stage of this. But if you are interested, you may want to participate or drop in on a session or at the forthcoming DRS conference, which Derek has to hand to promote, I'm sure, because he is Mr. DRS.
Yeah, I'm sure he does. Yeah, he will be able to probably.
And I think while he brings it up, it would be just exciting to say that will be the first time all 7 of us have met in person. Hopefully all 7. I know that there's still some question marks about whether we can all do it. But that will be the first time I've met any of these people for real, and I get to see exactly how tall James is. And we start to refer to each other not as James with the beard and glasses, or by letters or things like that. I'm slightly scared, actually. I'm really actually quite scared of meeting these guys in real life.
Yeah, has to be said.
Especially
no, on you go, James.
I was just going to say, especially Nicole. I think she'd want my ass, so I've got to be on my best behaviour.
Absolutely. Well, we met up in the Open University for the first time after about a year and a half, and I think seeing the detail of people's faces, I know it sounds really trivial and simple, but just physically seeing people, yeah, it was quite a shock almost. Okay, I've put a link to the main DRS conference. Unfortunately, I don't think I think the organisers are still working out how the sessions are going to pan out and to give a bit more detail and what's going to be happening face to face and online and so on and so forth. So I've just put a link to the main conference just now. We'll try to post more information on what we're trying to do as well as we move forward. As James says, the next stage is that we're putting forward the book proposal, and we'd maybe like to widen out the project a little bit, or at least let people know what's happening a little bit more. So we'll have a think about that over the next few weeks. But thank you very much for your time and all the questions and some of the feedback. That was really, really, really useful. And it'd be really good to connect with some people to keep this conversation going. Don't forget, as I say, the next meetup is on the 15th of April, Ishan Khosla. The time is to be confirmed, but hopefully it'll be round about 12 o'clock the same time. And his work, as I say, it really is super interesting. So thank you all very much for your time today. This has been one of the biggest sessions, and it was a really interesting one, and it's great to see everybody as always. Thank you very much.